You know, Canadians have obviously gone through some difficult times over the past few years with COVID and then the inflation that came out of the supply chain disruptions associated with COVID, and then interest rate increases to try to control inflation. It's been a challenging time, and it certainly has squeezed the affordability for many people, particularly those that live on fixed incomes and on modest incomes. And it's no wonder that people have had a lot of anxiety about their economic circumstances and about what the future may hold. That's true in Canada, but that's true in pretty much every G7 country around the world. And in that context, you know, that the anxiety, people are unhappy and looking for something that's actually going to help to address those things. It often doesn't matter even what the experience people had or the countries had during those tumultuous times were. I can tell people, you know, in Canada, we had one of the best records in terms of health outcomes from COVID. We actually had one of the fastest economic rebounds, partly because of the programs that the government put into place. We actually had lower inflation than every other country in the G7, and interest rates in Canada started coming down fastest. And Canada now actually is going to lead next year in growth in the G7. But that's not the way that people feel, and you have to actually be where people are and try to understand what they're feeling. And so I think it's important that, you know, I, as a representative of folks that are actually going to see this video, hear a little bit about what the government's doing and what it's actually going to do. Certainly in terms of what it has done, I would say we often gloss past, because this government has been so ambitious on so many fronts, we gloss past some fairly significant, sometimes historic achievements without actually acknowledging how important they are. If I look at some of the things that the government has done on childcare, we've been debating putting in place a national childcare program for 40 years. This government did it. There's still work to do, but this government did it. We put in place a dental care program, which is an extension of Medicare, to try to ensure that people on modest incomes actually have access to dental care, which is a health service. That is a historic achievement. If you think about where we were as a country in terms of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples under Stephen Harper, there is historic work that has been done. Not to say it's all done, but historic work that has been done. And on climate change, I mean, Canada was nowhere in the world on climate change. We now are perceived outside this country as one of the leaders that have turned around a major oil and gas producer and actually moved towards addressing the carbon issue in a thoughtful way, in a way that actually will create jobs and economic opportunity for Canadians in every region of this country. And people say that's all well and good, but what are you going to do going forward? And I say to those folks, we are far from done. You know, if you think about just some of the things that I talked about, we've put in place a national childcare program. We've brought rates down to the $10 a day, but we haven't actually fixed the problem fully of spaces. There's a lot of work to do there. On housing, we have brought in the National Housing Program, which has started to move the needle in terms of actually creating affordable housing in this country. But there is obviously so much more to do. On climate change, we've made a historic turnaround, but climate change isn't going away, and we need to continue that fight. And we need to continue an economy, building an economy that actually can create opportunity for our kids in a world that necessarily, scientifically, must be a lower carbon world. There is so much to do. I also say to folks that it's important that we actually think about what the government has done and what it is going to do in a manner that acknowledges that we haven't been perfect, that there have been challenges, and sometimes we haven't always got it right. That's true of every government, and any government that tells you they're perfect is not telling you the truth. But you can't measure this government, this prime minister, on the basis of perfection. You need to measure him on the basis of the alternative. And I would tell you, I have sat across from Mr. Poilievre for 9 years now. But his vision of Canada is quite a different vision of a Canada. It's about getting rid of housing supports, essentially not worrying about affordable housing for those that actually are vulnerable in society. He will get rid of the school food program. He will get rid of the dental care program. He will get rid of the national daycare program. On climate change, I don't know whether he doesn't believe in the science of climate change or he simply doesn't care about climate change. Either way, it's terrible. He will rip up all of the work that has been done to ensure that Canada is part of the international effort to address what is an existential threat to the future of the human race, to your kids, to my kids, and to our grandchildren. And his economic strategy for Canada is about simply extracting more and more oil and gas into a market that, if we are serious about climate change, must begin to decline over the coming decade. That's not a strategy for economic prosperity in the future. That's a strategy that comes straight out of the 1970s. At the end of the day, Mr. Poilievre will make us a poorer country, not just economically, although it certainly will be economically, but a poorer community in terms of how we actually work and deal with each other. And so I would just say, for those of you who are committed to a progressive Canada, this is a time where we actually need to get engaged. This is a time where you actually need to be putting your hand up to be part of the solution. Coming down and in my riding and working with me and my team, and in other ridings around the country doing exactly the same thing. This is going to be an enormously important election. I know you hear that from politicians often, but this is an enormously important election. It is something that I think will define very much the soul of this country for the next number of decades. So, hopefully you had a chance to actually think about this, and you will think about this going forward, and I look forward to engaging with all of you going forward.